If you've never played the Last of Us video game, I'm right there with you. I always sort of thought about it, never did, but you know what? I think we're actually going to enjoy this series a lot more than the people who played the video game. I'm Tyrone, welcome back to the Circle Club. We're obviously talking about The Last of Us Episode 1 and 2. Wow. Now, I don't love horror, and I hadn't played this video game like I said before, but man, they do such a great job with this opening pilots. I was like, just stunned. Pedro Pascal plays Joel, and his daughter Sarah is played by Nico Parker. We only get a brief amount of time with them, but it has this feeling that like when you're watching a movie where someone's presence can be felt throughout the scenes that they aren't even there. Like they just establish all the relationships so well, so quickly, like Joel, Sarah, Uncle Tommy, and just that whole community. And so when Joel finally has to kill the neighbors who he trusted Sarah to take care of when he wasn't there and all this stuff, like it just has this very human moment. From that moment, you knew this show was going to be about how death can really break someone's humanity. And we later see that with some of the drug addiction of the survivors and how they just handle this whole pandemic. I also just really love the relationship between Sarah and Joel. It seems as if she's sort of the parent figure, if you will, for him, even though he's the dad. And Uncle Tommy sort of seems like that reliable other adult figure in her life. And you just knew when you're watching that you're like, this is not gonna turn out good because this girl was not on the poster. And I also just think like the way that they show this pandemic is unlike any other zombie apocalypse pandemic type of TV show or movie. They show these little human elements, like people just rushing out of the theater, or like everyone going to the highway because everyone's thinking the same thing. You have this sort of like father or dad motive that takes over where you're like, I have to protect, you know? Like I honestly think that if it came down to it, Joel had to pick Sarah or Tommy, he would have definitely picked Sarah. And even with the neighbors, like they clearly have had a long time relationship, which is why Sarah feels comfortable enough to just walk through there. And in that decision, in that moment, Joel has to decide, do I protect my daughter or these people, try to figure out what's going on with them? And some of the other neighbors, unfortunately, chose to do the latter, which ends up whoosh for them. Now, the acting in this is just insane. You got Bella Ramsey, just chef's kiss, Pedro Pascal, Gabriel Luna, Anna Torv. Like, the chemistry between these folks, I was like, wow. Now, I didn't play the game, but I did watch a couple walkthroughs. I think I watched maybe to the first episode, honestly, of a walkthrough. And you just comparing the movement of the characters in the video game to how the actors are moving, it's almost one of one. And like the cinematography, like the point of view when they're in the car, it just makes you feel like you're a passenger along with it. And I think I like I said, I don't like horror, but what this does so well is it puts you in the position of what the characters are going through and feeling. Like when you're in the back of that car, that was something I think the video game super well is it made you feel as if you were there through that POV, and that's exactly what they do in this TV show. And I felt like I was getting nauseous in the back of the car. I'm like, oh my god, what are we gonna do? And that sort of anxiety, like that's what makes it scary, not necessarily a jump scare or the monsters or they look scary or any other thing. And I think it's the humanity that they put on the screen that is so terrifying, because it just makes you think, okay, we were just in a pandemic, we still kind of are, and what if something like this happened? And that leads me to the explanation of the virus. I absolutely loved how this show opens up. The explanation of the virus with the talk show and the host and the doctor. I mean, when you ask someone you think about a pandemic or what's the worst thing, you think of the common cold, a flu, or virus, something like that. But fungus and cordyceps, like those, I mean, you just don't think about a fungi being the most dangerous thing to humanity. And they do a really good job of showing how fungus and cordyceps operate and really how it's a zero-sum game. If those things want to take over and dominate, there's nothing we can do. And we actually see this in real life when fungi take over ants.
The fungus will force the ant to climb up above the anthill onto a tree or a plant where it will bite down on a leaf, effectively dying there. But before that happens, the fungus will mummify the ant, and then a mushroom will pop out of the ant's head, sporulating the rest of the colony. But like, it only affects ants, right? Wrong. There are over 600 species of cordyceps that affect all kinds of insects. You're not safe just because you're not an ant.
Imagine that happening to humanity. It's just terrifying. The fact that this is something that could actually happen. One thing that did surprise me was Ellie and Joel's relationship. I'm expecting them to get a little bit closer. Like, I knew nothing coming into this. Seriously, like, I watched that walkthrough, I mean, when I was in, like, college, like, years and years ago, right? And I always sort of thought that Ellie and Joel had this father and daughter relationship sort of thing, and I think we're going to see that as the story progresses. I mean, it makes sense, right? Joel loses Sarah, his daughter. Ellie's about the same age. He clearly has started to distance himself and is a bit reserved and cut off. And I think Ellie is sort of the opposite, even though she's sort of had that same trauma of being raised as an orphan, not having parents. And she's never really had a parent figure as far as we know. So I think they sort of complement each other, but they don't know how to necessarily embrace for that hug or embrace for that moment quite yet. And I think Joel sort of sees this as a transaction. There's just something in him where Tess was sort of like, you know, this is a transaction, we got to get her so we can get what we need. But there was always something with Joel where it just felt like he was looking at it from a more sensitive direction and a more emotional direction, I would suppose. And I imagine that we're going to see their relationship just thrive over these next few episodes. And the very next episode, it's just those two. And even that moment where they're just together, silent, like having that little conversation, you can just tell that he wants to be so distant, but like at the same time, you can't. And I think, again, going back to the theme of this show, humanity, I think we're going to see a lot more of those moments. Now, I don't know if this upset people who play the video game, but the director mentioned that the military was not chasing them in that library. He sort of said that he thought it would get tired, and I agree. I think, you know, they have bigger fish to fry, the military, right? And having them just sort of chase them around, these two people who escaped, it just doesn't really fit. And I just think the whole military-industrial complex bit, it just would have gotten a little bit old. I also think this is where this show thrives compared to some other zombie pandemic type shows, because it really focuses in on how and why this thing has happened, and it really gave us a strong foundational backstory. I really, really liked the opening, but also in the second episode's opening, when they go to Jakarta, that was really cool because I think we always get this American perspective, right? What was going on in America, but it sort of seemed as if they were doing this sort of patient zero thing, and we got to see this woman who is a specialist be like, oh my God, like, this is, you have no idea, like, you have to bomb Jakarta. And to me, when I'm watching that, I'm like, oh shit. This is legit. Like, this is not something that can be contained. This is not something that you can sort of ignore. Like, that told me there that I was like, okay, The Last of Us, there's only going to be like 1% or less of the population. And I think that so far in these first two episodes, what they've done a tremendous job with is just really giving us, the audience members, the gravitas of what is going on. It lets us know how intense this is. It lets us know the magnitude, the weight of these situations. And I just think that in these small little moments, like when we see them in the quarantine, you could just see everyone's on edge. Is just tense. That woman, she couldn't even bury that child. I mean, that was a crazy misdirection too, right? The child comes in, has a bite, and they sort of lie to him or give him this false hope, and he takes the injection, and you think in the moment, you're like, oh, maybe this will stabilize him a little bit, maybe they figured out something, and the quarantine is just for people who've been stabilized, and they're trying to reverse this, but no. They're like, we kill anyone who gets bitten by this thing. So, like, they have no cure, that they are just in survival mode, and I think that is something that provides a level of intensity with this show that I haven't seen with a lot of other pandemic type shows, because that provides context to the world building where you're watching it transpire versus being told. And also, just like, so far, who are your favorite characters? I heard that some of the characters are getting fleshed out a little bit more, so if you played the video game, how are they doing with that? And for those of you who didn't play the video game, just tell me which characters you're liking so far. I also just think The Last of Us overall benefits from its length and pacing. This is a story that's allowed to take its time with the storytelling. It doesn't rush or spend too long in one place, which makes you feel like you're constantly on edge. You're like, okay, boom, we got this beat, boom, we're to the next scene, boom. But when you're in those moments of the scene, it takes its time, the pacing. You get these sort of character moments. You can tell that these characters know each other prior, but they don't give us this long exposition of, oh, you know, is that Joel? Oh, yeah, Joel used to sell me, blah, blah, blah. You could just know, like, oh, there goes Joel. And like little moments and lines like that lets you know, okay, these two know each other. They clearly got some sort of problem or issue, right? They don't harbor on it too long because they're like, we got bigger fish to fry. And that sort of seems like a constant theme we're seeing, is that there's a bigger thing to worry about than these little frivolous fights and issues. So it'll be interesting as we get to these next episodes and when they meet new characters to see who has that sort of same mindset and ideology of like, hey, we're looking for a cure, or no, we're taking down the government, or it's survive or be killed kind of thing. And I think we're gonna start to see people fill into these different buckets. Lastly, this is set in Boston where I'm from, so I love that naturally. And I think Boston is actually a perfect hub for it during this pandemic-like story because it's got the resources, the educators, and honestly, the politics. And I'm not sure if Ellie is from Boston, but she definitely has that Boston attitude to her, that sort of chip on her shoulder kind of thing, and I think it fits perfectly for Joel, who comes from Texas, because I think a lot of Texans have that sort of similar thing. So you'll sort of see two fiery personalities have to kind of come together and cool. So I don't know, I mean, I was not expecting to like this. My boy Matt did a review, and that's what kind of sparked me to watch this. So I'm curious what you guys all think. If you played the video game, how are you liking it so far? Are the differences okay? Does it bother you? And for those of us who didn't play the video game, make sure you subscribe because I'm going to be making videos all the time. But I'm curious what you're loving about this, or what you're worried, or some of your predictions are. But HBO Max does it again. Another banger. The Last of Us is great. Would highly recommend you watch. That's going to do it for this video. I'll see you next time. And remember, as always, just be you. Peace.